This is the third part of a selection of readings from the novelisation of Richard Attenborough's film Shadowlands, written by Leonore Fleischer based on the true story of the relationship between C.S. Lewis and Joy Gresham. These readings concentrate mainly on the relationship between C.S. Lewis, familiarly known as Jack Lewis, and Peter Whistler, one of his students. In the summer of 1954, Lewis sees Whistler returning all his library books and is shocked to learn that Whistler plans to leave Oxford without completing his degree. In realising he is unable to help his student, C.S. Lewis is reminded of one of his stories. We live in the Shadowlands, the sun's shining somewhere else, round a bend in the road, over the brow of a hill. Some years have passed. C.S. Lewis finds himself dividing his time between the London hospital, where his wife Joy is seriously ill with cancer, and his home in Oxford. Oxford railway station and the platform for the London train had become by now almost a second home to Jack Lewis. Just about every day, but never less than 5 days a week, he stood waiting for the train that would carry him to his wife's hospital bed. The ride was not a long one in any case, an hour and 3/4, but to Lewis it seemed no time at all. So deep was he always sunk in his own thoughts. He couldn't concentrate on his newspaper, and would soon lay it aside unread. He took very little notice of stations en route or of the countryside speeding past the carriage window. He took no notice whatsoever of other passengers, so he was taken by surprise one day to hear his name spoken out loud in a familiar voice. "Mr. Lewis?" Jack looked up. A young man, no more than 26 or so, had just entered the carriage searching for an empty seat. His thoughts being so far away, at first Jack didn't recognise him. Then the face intruded into his consciousness, and he could put a name to it. Peter Whistler. The young man was more neatly dressed than Lewis had ever seen him, and his hair was tidily combed. Otherwise it was the same Whistler, the same restless spirit showing in his face. "Yes, it's me." Lewis was surprised to hear himself offering to buy Whistler a beer, and even more surprised when his former student accepted at once. They made their way gingerly down the swaying train corridor to the buffet carriage and ordered a couple of pints. Standing companionably side by side, they sipped their pints and stared out of the train window. "Funny how things work out," Lewis said at last. "I've not noticed that they do," Peter Whistler replied. "No, you're probably right." "Fight me, I can take it," quoted Whistler. Lewis smiled, surprised and pleased that the young man could recall something of his class, even if it was only that. But he was hardly in the mood for a verbal scrap. Standing by, day after helpless day, and watching his wife suffer the torments of the damned had drained a lot of the fight out of Lewis. It was peace, not conflict, that was his ambition now. "So what are you doing now?" he asked his former student. Whistler took a mouthful of drink. "Teaching. Feel free to give a hollow laugh." "No," Jack Lewis shook his head. "I suspect you're a born teacher." "I do turn out to be quite good at it," conceded Whistler grudgingly, but Jack could detect a note of pride in the young man's voice. "Didn't you tell me your father is a teacher?" "Yes." For a second he hesitated, then Peter Whistler added, "He died a few months ago." "I'm sorry," said Lewis sincerely. Whistler nodded and bit his lip, forcing the tears back. "I miss him. I loved him very much." "Did he know that?" Jack looked earnestly at the younger man. Whistler thought the question over. "I think so. I think he knew." "One has to say things," Lewis continued. "The moment passes and you're alone again." "Yes." "We read to know we're not alone. That's what he said, wasn't it? I've not forgotten that." Whistler nodded, overcome by emotion and unable to speak. Once more it struck Jack Lewis how inevitable it was, how God-ordained, that every human being should suffer loss. Without exception, every single person in the world would know at some point the excruciating pain of loss. For some, like young Whistler, it would come from losing a loved one. For others, it would be having nobody to love. And Jack suspected that by far and away the first might be easier to bear, because with all the agony that he and Joy were going through, separately and together, in loving her and in knowing that she loved him, Lewis was happier than he'd ever been in his life. Wasn't that some absurd divine paradox? Did it mean that God had a sense of humour?